Season's greetings and happy Friday the 13th. The only real holiday this December, if you ask me.
Happy Friday the 13th.
I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and since it's another Friday the 13th, I figured I might as well review another comic book series based on the Friday the 13th franchise. This time, Friday the 13th Badland.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get!
I last reviewed Jason's earliest comic adventures under the short-lived Topps Comics banner, and Badland is a much later entry in the comic canon, but seeing as how winter is just around the corner and we're already feeling its effects, might as well cover a winter-themed Friday the 13th story. And I know I could have reviewed that winter-themed Never Hike Alone sequel, but I decided to review a comic book, okay? So get off my back. Badland is, to date, one of the final official Friday the 13th comics, published as 2 issues from January to February of 2008 by the now-defunct Wildstorm Comics, founded by comic legend Jim Lee. Wildstorm began as an independent comics company called Aegis Entertainment, founded by Lee, but it was acquired as Wildstorm by DC Comics in 1998. Wildstorm started out with comics that took place within Jim Lee's shared superhero universe, but under DC, Wildstorm eventually expanded to also becoming the imprint DC would use for licensed comic books based on existing TV shows, movies, and video games. New Line had licensed the comic rights to Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchises to Avatar Press for several years, but with New Line owned by Warner Brothers by this point, and with WB owning DC, it only made synergistic sense to publish comics based on New Line's properties through DC via Wildstorm starting in 2007.
Told ya! Comic books was bad for ya!
This was very short-lived though, as DC shut Wildstorm down in 2010, and to this day never found a new home for comics based on Jason, Freddy, and Leatherface, which is a shame because overall Wildstorm's horror comics were cool. The art was often great and the writing was usually pretty good, often telling better and more innovative stories than the sequels in the film franchises they adapted. Friday the 13th Badland was written by Ron Mars and drawn by Mike Huddleston, and tells a story early in the history of Crystal Lake and seemingly makes the nature of the area's death curse more clear. Crystal clear, you might say, possibly providing an explanation for Crystal Lake's death curse. But is Friday the 13th Badland good? Land? I'll give my thoughts in my review, but first a message from my sponsor. Me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Here are the movies I'll be streaming next Sunday. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus streams, and I thank you in advance.
Welcome to God's country.
Badland tells 2 stories set in different time periods in the wilderness of Crystal Lake during a blizzard. One story revolves around a trio of trappers during pioneer days, and the other story involves a trio of hikers in modern times. The comic goes back and forth between the 2 narratives, with obvious parallels between them. The pioneer story obviously does not involve a time-traveling Jason Voorhees wearing a coonskin cap, but despite the lack of Jason in this side of the tale, it is the more important half of the story. The Jason narrative is a pretty standard Friday the 13th story that's just an anchor connecting Crystal Lake's past and present.
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
The 3 trappers are Ethan, Joseph, and Big Ben. Big Ben is an overly aggressive, violent maniac, while Ethan is much more noble and level-headed, and Joseph attempts to be an impartial mediator between the 2 men. But like usual, a neutral party will ultimately side with a bully out of pure fear. The hikers of the modern story are friends Phil, Jeremy, and Diane, who have a love triangle. The reserved Phil has had a long-term crush on Diane, but she's only really into the much more spontaneous Jeremy. Speaking of which, during a blizzard, the trio of hikers seek shelter from the storm in a nearby cabin at Camp Crystal Lake, and Jeremy breaks the door down, allowing the trio to spend the night inside the cabin and allowing anybody else in as well.
Jason!
Speaking of which, the trappers in the story are also themselves trapped in a snowstorm, looking for shelter to ride it out, and end up making themselves way too at home in a Native American mother's hut, acting neighborly, eating her and her child's food supply like they're doing her a favor. The timeless mindset of, you have something we want, we're just gonna take it.
Listen, you obviously don't know anything about Indians, okay? Probably none of you do.
This entitlement and bullying of a frightened mother is bad enough, but to take things into even darker territory, Big Ben and Joseph sexually assault the woman while Ethan watches holding her baby. And after this already horrible act, Joseph shoots the woman and her baby dead, thinking she was going to grab a weapon when it was just a rattle. This is all really grim and shocking for a Friday the 13th story where it's usually just Jason killing stereotypical teens in wacky ways. What happens in this comic is a much more real kind of brutality, but the comic is called Badland. Crystal Lake doesn't have the death curse that Crazy Ralph claimed because some kid maybe drowned in a lake within the last 70 years.
It's got a death curse.
The curse of Crystal Lake stretches further back, and its roots should be a real kind of ugly evil that would have lasting consequences, tainting a place forever. The trapper Ethan didn't participate in the horrifying acts of his associates, but he still stands by and lets it all happen. He scolds Big Ben and Joseph, but that's as far as Ethan is willing to go. It makes Ethan complicit in their actions through his inaction.
The counselors weren't paying any attention.
A running theme of the Friday the 13th series is that apathy and inaction equal death. The counselors fuck instead of watching Jason, and he ends up drowning. Visitors of Crystal Lake fail to heed the warnings and end up dead. But ultimately, all of this death could have been avoided if one person took action. The Trapper storyline of Badland is pretty heavy, but the Hiker story is relatively light, reflecting some of the pettier, comparatively inconsequential problems of modern life that amounts to essentially a love triangle. Phil has feelings for Diane, but she doesn't feel the same way about him, and Diane has been in a relationship with Jeremy behind Phil's back. Diane and Jeremy know about Phil's crush on Diane, but Diane doesn't tell Phil she's with Jeremy to avoid hurting Phil's feelings, when the more likely reason is that Diane wants to keep Phil in her orbit, continue manipulating Phil, and she doesn't want to risk losing Phil's dedication to her by telling him he doesn't have a chance with her, and letting the guy pursue someone else romantically while the two of them remain friends. Of course, a lot of guys aren't mature enough to settle on just being friends with their crush and act out, so it's definitely a subject that is difficult for a woman to broach. But ultimately, people that Phil saw as friends, who kept the nature of their relationship a secret, literally go behind his back and fuck while he's sleeping. And they would have gotten away with it too, if it hadn't been for a meddling hockey mask wearing weirdo and his power to sense when people are fucking within a 5-mile radius. Diane's screams of terror instead of pure ecstasy riding Jeremy's 3-inch cock wake up Phil. And Phil's just kinda done with both Diane and Jeremy for keeping their fucking a secret, and I guess not inviting Phil to join in. So Phil takes his chances out in the blizzard since he can't trust his friends anymore. It's just way too awkward.
And I'm a dead fuck.
Speaking of awkward situations, the trappers found themselves trapped in an even more awkward situation. The husband of the woman the trappers killed finds his wife and child not alive like how he left them, and the native man reasonably gets pissed. So the trappers continue on their neighborly course by blowing the grieving man's head off. But like hunting with Dick Cheney, the man somehow manages to survive taking a gunshot blast to the face seemingly. This Native American is essentially a predecessor to Jason Voorhees, a vengeance-seeking figure haunting the woods of Crystal Lake. The comic doesn't come with any context surrounding the nature of the seemingly undead native and his relation to the later Jason. Much like Jason himself, what the native becomes is kept ambiguous, and the comic leaves it open to interpretation. Maybe the comic suggests that this native and Jason are both Wendigo-like entities, physical manifestations of Crystal Lake's death curse. The comic avoids making any direct connections between Crystal Lake's first undead killer and its current one. I should mention, though, that issue 6 of Wildstorm's first Friday the 13th comic series offers a very explicit backstory for Jason, also involving Native Americans. A Tillamook tribe in 1850 was wiped out by settlers at Crystal Lake. The blood from the tribe's shaman entering the lake resulted in a death curse. The evil of the lake eventually inhabited Jason Voorhees. It's very explicitly stated that the real reason Jason is immortal and compelled to do nothing but kill is because of a Native American's magic shaman blood. The way this backstory is so nonchalantly told is fucking weird, too. It's safe to say that I don't like that explanation or some of that comic's other explicitly supernatural elements. But Badland, besides involving Native Americans in its plot, has no narrative links to that earlier Friday the 13th comic, and Badland's flashback seems to take place at a much earlier point before that first Wildstorm Comics flashback of a shaman getting beheaded, seemingly telling the first time outsiders ever made contact with the natives populating Crystal Lake. There are multiple possible explanations for Crystal Lake's death curse then, but ultimately Badland has no narration, making it all ambiguous. You can draw your own conclusions about the nature of Crystal Lake. Was it cursed or haunted, or is it just an inherently evil place where the dead can rise seeking revenge? There could be no connection between Jason and the undead native. They just happen to both be undead killers at Crystal Lake seeking revenge. The story focuses more on paralleling the two figures and the idea that Crystal Lake is a bad place where bad things have always happened. But those bad things also come with deadly consequences.
Look what you did to him!
Having killed the native's wife, Joseph suddenly becomes paranoid that Crystal Lake is a bad place they need to leave, becoming a precursor to Crazy Ralph.
The real prophet of doom, ain't he?
With Joseph ultimately dying similarly to Ralph against a tree. Big Ben, the hulking brute of the Trappers, isn't even able to put up a fight as his head is split open with a tomahawk. As Joseph dies, he seems to imply with his last words that Crystal Lake might have a dark influence on people. It makes them do evil things, but it could just be him deflecting blame from his own actions. Ultimately, Ethan loses an ear to the native, Mike Tyson style, and the pissed-off Native American receives an apology from Ethan for his party's transgressions right before Ethan's head is crushed in. Savage as fuck! Okay, I guess saying that catchphrase in this context is super racist, my bad.
Listen, you obviously don't know anything about Indians, okay? Probably none of you do.
The conclusion of the hikers' story is a little more cut and dry. Diane tells Jeremy to find Phil out in the blizzard, but Jeremy only finds a neck full of machete. If he ever wants to get head from Diane again, he's gonna have to find his own first. After finding Jeremy's decapitated body, Phil's no longer upset about not getting to fuck Diane as he barricades the cabin. But I bet he wishes he got laid one last time before getting skull-fucked with a trekking pole. Diane is the last woman standing, and she puts up a valiant fight, but the heroines of these Friday the 13th comics rarely survive their stories or beat Jason. I figure for the sake of publishing more frequent comic stories, it'd be tedious to have Jason die at the end of an issue and explain how he comes back in the next issue. Easier to just always have Jason win. Jason's victory is paralleled with the native's past defeat of his foes. Jason takes his latest victim into the icy waters of Crystal Lake just as the native did, who took his wife and child to a shared icy grave. Like everything else in the comic, the natures of these final acts is ambiguous. Maybe the vengeful spirit of the native lives on in Jason. Maybe Jason offers the lake his kills as a sacrifice to calm the restless spirits residing in the lake. Who knows? The story of the native might not have even happened. It could just be an old legend that parallels Jason's modern myth, reminding us without making Jason sympathetic or delving into his backstory directly at all, that Jason is seeking revenge against the people of Crystal Lake for what they did to him and his mother, his family. It's an effective way to refocus Jason as a character.
Make them remember me, Jason.
Also effective is the artwork of Badland by Mike Huddleston. It's very stylized and cartoony. Jason is essentially a wall with a tiny head. His eyes are just pure white like Batman. It's an exaggerated and streamlined approach to the visuals that looks like it could be from a Friday the 13th animated show. Seeing Crystal Lake minimalistically rendered as a cold white void etched with desolate trees is eerie. It really is a place where nothing can hope to live.
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
Friday the 13th Badland is a pretty good example of Wildstorm's experimental anthology approach to the Friday the 13th series, exploring an entirely new corner of Crystal Lake's mythos while also telling a familiar story that directly parallels the comic's new lore. The comic doesn't make the mistake of telling an explicit origin story, though, trying to directly explain anything. It's not like Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers, where, yes, Michael explicitly has a thorn curse and rocks can stop him. No, Badland simply tells a tale early on in Crystal Lake's Lake's history with a killer that evokes Jason and leaves it completely up to you what that means in the greater canon, presenting another Crystal Lake mystery to think about. Ultimately, Badland just gets across that Crystal Lake is a place where tragedy has and will always happen. It's a bad land, but a good comic. I give Friday the 13th Badland a Phil out of Jeremy. Happy Friday the 13th and happy holidays, everybody! This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.